The flatbed trucks rolled through the cornfields of Iowa in the summer of 1943, carrying cargo that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. German prisoners of war, men who had fired on American troops in North Africa and Sicily, were being driven past white farmhouses and red barns to work the very fields that fed the nation fighting against their homeland. The farmers waiting at the end of those dirt roads stood with their arms crossed, faces hard, watching these enemy soldiers step down from the trucks under armed guard. Nobody smiled. Nobody waved. The air hung thick with suspicion and something deeper, the fresh wound of war that had already claimed too many Iowa sons. But what happened next, over the course of months and then years, would become one of the most unexpected stories to emerge from World War II. Because these prisoners didn't just work Iowa's fields and then disappear into history, some of them stayed. Even after the war ended, even after they were free to go home, they chose to remain in the place where they had once been captives. They married Iowa women, bought Iowa farms, raised Iowa children, and became so woven into the fabric of small-town life that decades later their German accents were simply part of the landscape, as familiar as the sound of wind through corn. This is the story of how enemy soldiers became neighbors, how barbed wire gave way to barn raisings, and how the Iowa prairie witnessed a transformation that no one, neither the guards nor the prisoners nor the families who had every reason to hate them, could have predicted. It begins not with peace, but with the desperate arithmetic of war and the practical problem of too many empty fields and too few hands to work them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By the spring of 1943, Iowa faced a crisis that threatened to undermine the entire war effort. The state's farms, which produced nearly one-fifth of the nation's corn, and massive quantities of soybeans, hogs, and cattle, were hemorrhaging workers. Over 200,000 Iowa men had enlisted or been drafted, leaving behind fields that still needed planting, livestock that still needed tending, and harvests that wouldn't wait for the war to end. Farm wives and elderly fathers tried to fill the gaps, working dawn to dusk until their bodies gave out. Teenagers dropped out of school to drive tractors. But it wasn't enough. The numbers simply didn't work. The federal government understood what was at stake. American troops needed to eat, and so did the millions of Allied soldiers and civilians depending on American food shipments. If Iowa's harvest failed, the entire war effort would suffer. So Washington made a decision that seemed practical on paper, but morally complicated in practice. They would use the one labor source available in abundance: German prisoners of war. The first POW camp in Iowa opened near Algona in April of 1943. The site, a former civilian conservation corps camp, sprawled across windswept prairie in Kossuth County. Within weeks, rows of wooden barracks had been erected, surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers that looked almost apologetic compared to the fortifications the Germans had left behind in Europe. The camp was designed to hold 1,000 prisoners, but by the end of 1943, it housed over 3,000, with 34 smaller branch camps scattered across the state, each containing between 100 and 250 men. The prisoners who stepped off trains in Algona came from diverse backgrounds. Some were Afrika Korps veterans captured in Tunisia, hardened soldiers who had fought under Rommel in the desert. Others were submarine crews pulled from the Atlantic after their U-boats were sunk. Still others were young, conscripts, barely 18, who had surrendered in Sicily or Italy without firing more than a handful of shots. What united them was exhaustion and profound confusion about what came next. German propaganda had prepared them for American brutality. They expected starvation rations, forced labor unto death, perhaps execution. The Geneva Convention was, they had been told, a piece of paper the Americans would ignore the moment it became inconvenient. So when they arrived at Camp Algona and found barracks with real beds, mess halls serving 3 meals a day, and recreational areas where they could play soccer, the cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. One prisoner, Werner Schmidt, a former schoolteacher from Bavaria, who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht at age 32, later wrote in his memoir that his first meal at Algona consisted of beef stew, white bread, coffee, and canned peaches. He sat staring at the tray, convinced it was a trick, that this abundance was meant to soften them before some darker fate arrived. It took him 2 weeks to accept that the food was real and would continue. Some prisoners gained 15 pounds in their first month of captivity, their bodies slowly remembering what it felt like to be adequately fed. The daily routine at Algona followed military precision, but without the brutality these men had grown accustomed to under Wehrmacht discipline. Réveillé sounded at 6 in the morning, roll call at 6:30, breakfast at 7, then work details, camp maintenance, or educational programs until lunch. Afternoons were dedicated to more work, sports, or the remarkable variety of cultural activities the prisoners organized for themselves. The camp had a library stocked with German language books carefully vetted to exclude Nazi propaganda. There was a theatre group that staged plays on a makeshift stage built from scrap lumber. An orchestra formed, using donated instruments, and gave concerts that drew not only prisoners but also guards and occasionally curious locals who stood outside the fence to listen. The American guards, mostly older men or those classified 4F, unfit for combat duty, maintained professional distance but without systematic cruelty. They were farmers and shop owners in uniform, men who understood that these prisoners were someone's sons and brothers, just as their own boys fighting overseas were someone's sons and brothers. This didn't mean fraternization or friendship, not at first, but it did mean a baseline of human decency that shocked prisoners who had been trained to see Americans as mongrels and weaklings corrupted by democracy. What surprised the Germans most profoundly was the location. They had expected confinement in coastal military prisons or industrial internment camps. Instead, they found themselves in the heart of the American agricultural heartland, surrounded by rolling fields of corn and soybeans that stretched to the horizon. The farms were visible from the camp fence. On quiet evenings, prisoners could hear tractors working the fields, livestock calling across the distance, and the sounds of ordinary rural life continuing despite the war. The citizens of Algona and the surrounding communities watched the camp's establishment with feelings that shifted like Iowa weather, unpredictable and intense. Their sons and husbands were fighting these same men across the Atlantic and Pacific. Gold stars already hung in too many windows, marking families who would never see their boys come home. The local newspaper, the Algona Upper Des Moines, ran carefully worded editorials, acknowledging the economic necessity of the camp while avoiding any suggestion that Germans deserved sympathy. Eleanor Jensen, a farmer's wife whose son was serving with Patton's Third Army, captured the community's fractured conscience in a letter to her sister, dated June of 1943. She wrote about seeing a work detail of POWs repairing a road near their farm, young men who could have been her son's classmates, if not for the accident of birth and nationality. She confessed feeling simultaneously furious that they were alive, while American boys died daily, and uncomfortably aware that these prisoners looked scared and homesick rather than like the monsters she had imagined. But practical necessity has a way of overwhelming ideology, especially on farms where crops won't wait for moral clarity. By late May of 1943, the first prisoner work details were deployed to Iowa farms under a program that paid farmers 75 cents per prisoner per day. The government handled transportation and supervision. The prisoners received 10 cents daily in camp script they could use to buy small luxuries like soap, cigarettes, or stationery. Everyone pretended the arrangement wasn't morally grotesque, that enemy soldiers laboring in American fields while their countrymen still fought didn't create impossible contradictions. The first morning that German POWs arrived at the Hoffman farm outside Algona, Robert Hoffman stood in his yard with his jaw clenched so tight his wife thought he might crack a tooth. 8 men in faded Wehrmacht uniforms stepped down from a military truck, their eyes cast down, shoulders tense with anticipation of hostility. An armed guard, a middle-aged corporal named Miller who ran the feed store in town before the war, explained the work detail procedures with the tone of a man who also found the situation deeply strange. The prisoners would work from 8 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon, with an hour break for lunch. They were not to be given alcohol, cash, or anything that could be used as a weapon. They were to be treated, the corporal said carefully, in accordance with Geneva Convention standards. Hoffman nodded, said nothing, and pointed toward the cornfield that needed weeding. For the first 3 days, communication consisted entirely of gestures and the occasional barked command. Hoffman pointed at Rose. The prisoners worked them. He indicated when to break for water. They drank in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of hose against soil and the rustle of corn leaves in the June breeze. Hoffman's wife, Martha, brought lunch for the guards but left the prisoners to eat their own rations at the far end of the field. At night, the prisoners returned to Camp Algona, and the Hoffmans sat at their dinner table, not discussing the fact that enemy soldiers had spent the day on their land. But something began to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, in the way such things always do when human beings are forced into prolonged proximity. On the 4th day, one of the prisoners, a young man named Carl Becker, who had been a carpenter's apprentice before the war, noticed that Hoffman was struggling with a broken fence post. Becker gestured, asking in broken English if he could help. Hoffman hesitated, then nodded. Within 15 minutes, Becker had repaired the post, with a skill that impressed Hoffman despite himself. That evening, Hoffman mentioned to his wife that at least one of them knew his way around tools. By the end of the 2nd week, basic communication had evolved into something more complex. The prisoners were learning rudimentary English, picking up farming terms through repetition and necessity. Hoffman discovered that 2 of them had grown up on farms in Germany and actually understood crop rotation, animal husbandry, and the rhythm of agricultural life in ways that transcended nationality. When a piece of equipment broke down, these men didn't need detailed instructions. They simply saw what needed doing and did it. The breakthrough came on a sweltering afternoon in late June, when temperatures climbed into the mid-90s, and the humidity made the air feel like a wet blanket. The prisoners had been working since morning without complaint, but Hoffman could see exhaustion setting in. Martha, watching from the farmhouse window, made a decision that surprised even herself. She filled a pitcher with lemonade, gathered some cups, and walked out to the field. The silence when she appeared was absolute. The prisoners froze, uncertain. The guard looked uncomfortable, aware that fraternization policies were vague but generally discouraged. Martha simply poured lemonade and handed cups around, including to the guard, and said in a voice that made clear this was not up for debate, that it was too hot to work without something cold to drink. The prisoners accepted the cups with visible shock. One of them, a former medic named Hans Richter, said "Danke schön" so softly it was almost inaudible. Martha nodded and walked back to the house, leaving the men to process what had just happened. That evening, Hoffman found himself thinking about the expression on Richter's face when he'd sipped that lemonade, the way his eyes had closed for just a moment, as if savouring not just the drink but the simple kindness it represented. Hoffman didn't want to feel sympathy for these men. His nephew was fighting in the Pacific. His neighbour's son had died at Kasserine Pass. But he also couldn't ignore what he'd witnessed. Human gratitude so profound it was almost painful to watch. The lemonade incident became a turning point, not just at the Hoffman farm but across Kossuth County, as word spread through the informal network that connected rural communities. If Martha Hoffman, whose nephew was in combat, could show basic decency, then maybe the sky wouldn't fall if others did the same. Within weeks, the pattern repeated at farm after farm. A thermos of coffee appeared at morning break. Extra sandwiches materialized at lunch. Farmers, who had initially maintained rigid silence, found themselves in actual conversations, learning the prisoners' names, their backgrounds, the details of their lives before the war. The work itself created bonds that ideology couldn't prevent. There's something about shared labour, about planting, rows side by side under the same sun, pulling the same stubborn weeds, wrestling the same ornery livestock, that strips away abstractions. The German prisoners weren't monsters from propaganda posters. They were men who got blisters, who laughed when a pig escaped and led everyone on a chase through the mud, who showed each other photographs of their families with expressions of longing that transcended language. By August of 1943, some Iowa farmers were specifically requesting the same prisoner work crews to return. These weren't just labourers anymore. They were Karl, who could fix any engine, Hans, who had a gift for calming skittish horses, Friedrich, who sang while he worked, German folk songs that drifted across the fields and somehow didn't sound foreign anymore, just part of the soundscape. The prisoners, for their part, found in this work something they hadn't experienced in years, purpose that wasn't about destruction, days that ended in creation rather than death, and the strange comfort of routine that made them feel almost human again. Not every interaction was smooth. Language barriers led to misunderstandings. Cultural differences created awkward moments. Some prisoners remained rigid and hostile, still ideologically committed to the Reich despite its defeats. And some farmers never softened, maintaining cold professional distance that prevented anything resembling friendship. But these were increasingly the exceptions. The general drift, propelled by proximity and necessity, and the simple human need for connection, was toward something warmer. The transformation didn't happen overnight or uniformly, but by the fall harvest of 1943, something remarkable was unfolding across Iowa's fields. Prisoner work details had become integral to the agricultural economy. Over 5,000 German POWs were deployed from camps across the state, working corn harvests, soybean processing, and livestock operations that kept food flowing to American troops and allies overseas. The federal government's gamble had paid off economically, but the unexpected dividend was human connection that official policy had never intended to foster. The harvest season created its own intensity, a shared urgency that further broke down barriers. When weather threatened crops, when rain clouds gathered and every available hand was needed to bring in corn before it was ruined, nationality became irrelevant. Farmers and prisoners worked together in frantic coordination, loading wagons, filling silos, racing against approaching storms. After successful harvests, there were moments of collective relief that felt like celebration. Tired men sitting on tailgates, sharing water, and catching their breath, united by the simple satisfaction of work completed. Children became unexpected ambassadors in this slow reconciliation. Iowa farm kids, despite parental warnings, were fascinated by the prisoners. They heard unfamiliar accents, saw men in strange uniforms, and with the fearless curiosity of youth, wanted to understand. Some prisoners began carving small wooden toys during their limited free time, simple animals or trucks whittled from scrap wood. When farmers' children wandered too close, these toys would be offered shyly, gifts that said what language barriers prevented. I mean you no harm. I am not your enemy. Parents were torn, afraid yet touched. Mary Schneider, whose husband was serving with the Army Air Corps in England, watched her 6-year-old daughter accept a carved wooden horse from a German prisoner named Josef Klein. She wanted to snatch it away, to protect her child from the enemy. But she also saw Klein's eyes, the way they crinkled with genuine pleasure at the girl's delight, and she recognized something she couldn't deny. This was a father missing his own children, finding brief solace in a child's smile. These small gestures accumulated into something larger. By early 1944, the psychological landscape had shifted measurably. The prisoners were less guarded, their initial terror of American captivity replaced by tentative trust. The farmers and their families, while still carrying grief and anger about the war, had begun to separate the men working their fields from the abstract evil of the Nazi regime. This wasn't forgiveness, exactly. Nobody forgot why these men were prisoners, but it was recognition of shared humanity. The Iowa winter of 1943-44 tested these nascent bonds. Work details decreased as fields lay dormant, but some farmers requested prisoner help with barn repairs, equipment maintenance, and livestock care. These winter months, with their enforced closeness, working together in confined spaces against brutal cold, accelerated the relationship building. In drafty barns, while mending tools or tending animals, conversations deepened. Prisoners talked about their lives before the war, their families, their hopes that Germany might somehow survive the catastrophe Hitler had created. Farmers shared their own stories, their worries about sons overseas, their determination to keep farms running until the boys came home. Otto Bauer, a former law student from Hamburg who had been conscripted in 1942, spent the winter of '44 working for the Peterson family near Britt. James Peterson, whose two sons were both serving in Europe, initially resented Bauer's presence, but by February they had developed an unlikely routine, working together in the mornings, then sitting in the barn during lunch break where Peterson taught Bauer idiomatic English and Bauer taught Peterson German phrases. Peterson's wife, Agnes, began including extra portions in her husband's lunch, tacitly acknowledging that Bauer needed feeding too. When Bauer learned that one of the Peterson sons had been wounded at Anzio, he wrote a letter, never sent but found later in his effects, expressing sorrow that drew no distinction between American and German suffering. The camp at Algona evolved into something more than a detention facility. The prisoners, recognizing they might be in Iowa for years, invested in making the space livable. They built a swimming pool using concrete and labor, created elaborate gardens with vegetables and flowers, constructed a recreation hall where they staged increasingly sophisticated theatrical productions. Local newspapers, which had initially covered the camp with suspicion, began running feature stories about these projects, often with an undertone of surprise that enemy prisoners could create beauty. The most remarkable creation was a nativity scene, constructed in the winter of 1944–45 by Eduard Kaib, a prisoner who had been a sculptor before the war. Using whatever materials he could scavenge, concrete from demolished buildings, scrap metal, bits of coloured glass, Kaib created an elaborate 60-figure nativity that stood over 4 feet tall. The detail was extraordinary. Figures of Mary and Joseph, the 3 wise men, shepherds and angels, all rendered with artistic skill that stunned everyone who saw it. Kaib worked on it for months, pouring into it not just craft but something deeper, a spiritual reckoning with the world's brutality and a desperate hope for redemption. When the nativity was completed and displayed at the camp's Christmas service in December of 1944, something unexpected happened. Local civilians, who had initially been forbidden from visiting the camp, were permitted to view the work. Hundreds came, farmers and shop owners and ministers, people who had feared and resented the prisoners. They stood before Kaib's creation in silence, recognizing artistry and devotion that transcended politics. Some were moved to tears, though they couldn't quite articulate why, maybe because the nativity represented everything the war had tried to destroy: beauty, faith, hope, the possibility that even in captivity and defeat, human beings could still reach for something transcendent. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The winter of 1944–45 was also when news of German concentration camps began filtering back to the United States in undeniable detail. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe, they encountered Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau, discovering horrors that shocked even those who thought they understood the war's brutality. Newsreels played in Iowa theaters, showing skeletal survivors and mass graves, images that created fresh waves of anger toward all Germans, including the prisoners working Iowa farms. Some farmers immediately terminated their work contracts, unable to reconcile the kindness they had shown with the evil that had been perpetrated. The prisoners themselves faced a devastating moral reckoning. Many had genuinely not known about the camps, or had dismissed reports as Allied propaganda. Now, confronted with undeniable evidence, they had to process their complicity in a regime that had committed genocide. Camp officials reported increased attendance at religious services as prisoners sought frameworks for understanding collective guilt. But even this horror didn't completely sever the relationships that had formed. Many Iowa families made distinctions, however imperfect, between German soldiers and the SS, between men who had fought a terrible war and those who had operated death camps. It was morally complicated terrain with no easy answers, but most people navigated it by focusing on the individuals they knew. Karl, who repaired their tractors, hadn't run Auschwitz. Hans, who sang in the barn, wasn't responsible for the gas chambers. This reasoning wasn't perfect, wasn't even entirely fair. but it allowed relationships to survive knowledge that might otherwise have destroyed them. The end of the war in Europe came in May of 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. At Camp Algona, the reaction was muted, complex. The prisoners understood they had lost, that Hitler's 1,000-year Reich had collapsed in just 12 years of catastrophic destruction. Many felt profound relief that the dying had stopped. Others wrestled with shame, particularly as more details of Nazi atrocities emerged. But above all, they felt desperate uncertainty about what came next. When would they go home? Would there even be homes to return to? And what did the future hold for a Germany divided and occupied by its conquerors? The answer to when they would go home turned out to be not soon. Repatriation happened slowly, agonizingly so for men desperate to learn if their families had survived the war's final apocalyptic months. The logistics of returning hundreds of thousands of POWs to a Germany with shattered infrastructure meant that Camp Algona didn't begin significant releases until late 1946. Many prisoners remained in Iowa until 1947, working under modified conditions as paid laborers rather than captives, helping address persistent agricultural labor shortages while Germany underwent occupation and reconstruction. This extended stay created its own dynamic. The men who had formed relationships with Iowa families found themselves in strange limbo, no longer enemies, not quite friends, existing in undefined space that social conventions struggled to name. And for some, as the months stretched into years, something unexpected began to crystallize. The idea that maybe, just maybe, their futures lay not in returning to a devastated Germany they barely recognized anymore, but in staying in Iowa, the place where they had discovered unexpected kindness and where life, despite everything, felt possible again. Werner Schmidt, the former schoolteacher from Bavaria, was among the first to articulate this thought. By early 1947, he had been working for the Hoffman farm for nearly 4 years. He knew every field, every piece of equipment, every animal by temperament. He had learned English fluently, absorbed American customs, developed genuine affection for Robert and Martha Hoffman, who had become something like the parents he'd lost to Allied bombing. When his repatriation orders finally came in March of 1947, Schmidt sat in the Hoffman kitchen and asked a question that stunned everyone. What would it take for him to stay? The Hoffmans had never considered this possibility. They looked at each other, then at Schmidt, this German soldier who had somehow become part of their lives, and didn't know how to answer. The legal hurdles seemed insurmountable. He was an enemy alien. Immigration law didn't have provisions for POWs who wanted to become citizens. And beyond legalities, there was the social question. How would the community react to a German prisoner choosing to remain, to become one of them? But Schmidt wasn't alone in asking. By mid-1947, at least 15 prisoners at Camp Algona had expressed similar desires. Some, like Schmidt, had formed deep bonds with farming families. Others had fallen in love with Iowa women, relationships that had developed despite strict non-fraternization policies, connections that bloomed in the spaces where regulations couldn't quite reach. Still others simply saw more opportunity in Iowa than in returning to a Germany where cities lay in ruins, jobs were scarce, and the future looked bleak. Carl Becker, the carpenter who had repaired Hoffman's fence post 4 years earlier, had fallen in love with Ruth Anderson, a war widow whose husband had died at Normandy. Their relationship had begun as friendship, brief conversations during work breaks that gradually deepened into something neither had anticipated. By 1946, despite the moral complications and social taboos, they both understood they wanted a future together. When Becker's repatriation date approached, Ruth did something that shocked her family and divided her community. She announced she would marry him and help him navigate whatever legal process might allow him to stay. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Ruth's late husband's family considered her planned marriage an unforgivable betrayal. Her brother-in-law, Harold Anderson, who had served in the Pacific, refused to speak to her. Anonymous letters arrived, calling her a traitor and worse. The local American Legion post debated whether to formally condemn the marriage, though they ultimately decided against it, recognizing they had no actual authority to prevent it. Church ladies whispered behind their hands at Sunday services. Some neighbors stopped speaking to her entirely, but Ruth was stubborn, a quality her late husband had loved, and she refused to let others dictate her life. She'd spent 3 years mourning, 3 years watching other women rebuild their lives while hers remained frozen in grief. Carl had shown her that it was possible to feel something other than sorrow, that the future didn't have to be just an echo of loss. She knew people would judge her. She also knew that life was too short and too precious to sacrifice happiness on the altar of other people's opinions. The legal pathway for enemy prisoners to remain in the United States didn't exist in any clear form. Immigration law in 1947 was designed to control who entered the country, not to accommodate those who had arrived as captives and now wished to stay. The answer came from Thomas Ridgway, an attorney in Algona who had lost his son at Iwo Jima. Ridgway's initial reaction when approached by the Hoffmans on Schmidt's behalf was anger. His son had died fighting Germans, and now he was being asked to help a German prisoner stay in Iowa. But Martha Hoffman persisted, explaining how Schmidt had become part of their lives, how he had proven himself through 4 years of honest work. Ridgway agreed to meet Schmidt, intending it to be brief and conclusive. The meeting lasted 3 hours. They discussed the war, grief, guilt, and the possibility of moving forward without forgetting. Schmidt didn't minimize his service in the Wehrmacht or claim innocence from the regime's crimes. He simply argued that he couldn't undo the past, but he could try to build a different future. By the meeting's end, Ridgway had agreed to take the case, telling his wife that night that maybe helping Schmidt stay was a way of honoring what his son had fought for, a world where people could choose peace over continued hatred. The legal strategy Ridgway developed became the template for other POW cases. First, the prisoners would return to Germany as required by their repatriation orders, establishing compliance with military procedures. Once there, they would apply for immigration to the United States as civilians, using agricultural skills and American sponsors to argue they would contribute to society. The process could take months or years, with no guarantee of success, but it was the only pathway available. Schmidt departed Iowa in April of 1947, along with most of the remaining prisoners at Camp Algona. The farewell at the Hoffman farm was emotional, in ways that would have seemed impossible 4 years earlier. Robert Hoffman, who had once stood rigid with resentment watching German prisoners arrive, shook Schmidt's hand and told him there would always be a place for him if he managed to return. Martha cried, then scolded herself for crying over a German soldier, then cried more because the whole situation was absurd and heartbreaking and wonderful all at once. Back in Bavaria, Schmidt found a Germany he barely recognized. His hometown of Landshut had been heavily bombed. The house he grew up in was rubble. His parents were dead, killed in an air raid in 1944. His younger sister had survived, but was living in desperate poverty, trying to feed her children in a collapsed economy where a pound of butter cost a month's wages. Schmidt stayed long enough to help her establish some stability, sharing money he had saved from his POW work wages, then began the immigration application process. The American consulate in Munich processed hundreds of applications monthly from Germans seeking to escape the ruins of their homeland. Schmidt's case stood out. Former POW, sponsored by an Iowa farm family, requesting return to the place of his captivity. The consular officer who interviewed him, a career diplomat named Harrison Wells, had spent the past 2 years witnessing Germany's devastation. He approved Schmidt's application with a note that the case represented the kind of reconciliation America should encourage. Carl Becker faced a similar journey. He returned to Germany in May of 47, found his family's carpentry shop destroyed and his father dead from malnutrition during the final months of the war. His mother and younger brother had survived but were living in a displaced persons camp. Becker helped them resettle, then applied for his immigration visa, listing Ruth Anderson as his fiancée and sponsor. The waiting was excruciating. Letters between Iowa and Germany took weeks. Ruth sent packages of food, clothing, and small amounts of money. Becker worked odd jobs in the ruins of Hamburg, saving every Pfennig, counting the days until he might return to the woman he loved. The immigration approvals came slowly, processing through bureaucratic channels that seemed designed to test patience. Schmidt's visa was approved in November of 1947, nearly 7 months after he'd left Iowa. He boarded a ship in Bremerhaven on a cold December morning, standing at the rail as Germany disappeared behind him, wondering if he was making the biggest mistake of his life or the smartest decision. The Atlantic crossing took 11 days. He spent most of it on deck, watching the horizon, rehearsing English phrases, and trying to imagine what his new life would be. When Schmidt's ship docked in New York in late December, Robert and Martha Hoffman were waiting at the Immigration Processing Center with paperwork declaring him their sponsored agricultural worker. The reunion was awkward at first, all three of them suddenly aware that this was no longer a temporary arrangement but a permanent commitment. Then Martha stepped forward and hugged Schmidt, and the awkwardness dissolved into relief and joy. They drove back to Iowa in the Hoffmans' truck. Schmidt pressed against the window, watching America roll past, this country that had been his enemy and was now somehow his home. The community's reaction to Schmidt's return was mixed. Some neighbors welcomed him back. These were the families who had worked alongside him, who had seen his character revealed through years of honest labor. Others were coldly disapproving, seeing his presence as an insult to the memory of those who hadn't come home from the war. Schmidt understood both responses. He kept his head down, worked hard, and let his actions speak. He attended church services where some parishioners pointedly ignored him, while others shook his hand. He shopped at stores where some clerks were friendly and others grimly silent. He existed in the spaces Iowa was willing to give him, grateful for acceptance where it came and patient with resistance where it remained. Carl Becker's immigration approval came in March of 1948. He arrived in Iowa in early April, and within 2 weeks, he and Ruth were married in a small ceremony at the county courthouse. Ruth's family didn't attend. The witness list consisted of 3 people, the Hoffmans and Thomas Ridgway. The ceremony took 10 minutes. Afterward, they drove to the small house Ruth's late husband had bought before shipping overseas, the house she'd lived in alone for 4 years, and began building a life together. The marriage provoked controversy that lingered for years. Some townspeople never forgave Ruth for what they saw as betrayal, but others, particularly women who had also lost husbands or sons, surprised everyone by defending her choice. Margaret Olson, whose son had died at Guadalcanal, wrote a letter to the Algona newspaper, arguing that if Ruth could find happiness after grief, that was something to celebrate, not condemn. The letter sparked fierce debate, letters to the editor for and against, but it also gave permission to those who wanted to accept the marriage but had been afraid to say so publicly. By 1949, 7 former POWs from Camp Algona had successfully immigrated back to Iowa. Each had his own story. Otto Bauer, the law student who had befriended the Peterson family, returned and eventually passed the Iowa bar exam, becoming one of the first German immigrants to practice law in the state. Hans Richter, the medic who had received Martha's first glass of lemonade, married a nurse he'd met during a hospital work detail and bought a small farm near Britt. Friedrich Weber, who had sung German folk songs in the fields, became a music teacher at the local high school, his accent eventually just part of his charm. These men didn't try to hide their German origins or pretend the war hadn't happened. They spoke openly about their experiences, their service, their capture, and their transformation. They became living bridges between 2 worlds, able to explain Germany to their Iowa neighbors and Iowa to the German relatives they wrote to regularly. Their children grew up bilingual, comfortable in both cultures, embodying a reconciliation that would have seemed impossible in 1943. The process wasn't always smooth. There were incidents. In 1951, someone painted Nazi on Werner Schmidt's barn door. Carl Becker was denied membership in the local Rotary Club until 1954. Otto Bauer lost his first 3 job applications at law firms before finding one willing to hire him. But these men persisted, understanding that they were carrying a weight heavier than personal ambition. They were proving that former enemies could become citizens, that redemption was possible, that the future didn't have to be imprisoned by the past. The Iowa communities gradually, grudgingly, then more warmly accepted them. Schmidt became known as the man who would help any neighbor with machinery problems, showing up with tools and expertise whenever someone's tractor broke down. Becker's carpentry skills were in high demand. He built additions to houses, repaired church pews, and crafted furniture that became family heirlooms. Richter's farm became a model of efficiency, and other farmers asked his advice on crop rotation and livestock management. These practical contributions mattered in rural communities where a person's worth was measured by what they could do and how they treated others. By the 1960s, most of the controversy had faded. The former POWs had been in Iowa longer than many other residents. Their children attended local schools, played on sports teams, and dated the children of families whose sons had fought against Germany. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but it no longer seemed shocking. Time and familiarity had done what policy never could, transformed strangers into neighbors, enemies into friends, outsiders into integral parts of the community fabric. Werner Schmidt never returned to Germany. He married an Iowa woman in 1952, raised 3 children, and farmed the land the Hoffmans eventually sold to him. When Robert Hoffman died in 1968, Schmidt delivered the eulogy, speaking about a man who had shown him that hatred wasn't inevitable, that kindness could bridge any divide. Martha Hoffman lived until 1985. In her final years, she often told visitors that Werner was the son she'd never had, and that she thanked God every day for bringing him into their lives, even under such strange circumstances. Carl and Ruth Becker celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1998, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and a community that had long since forgotten to think of Carl as anything other than one of their own. Ruth lived to be 92. At her funeral in 2006, the pastor noted that she had taught the town an important lesson: that love doesn't recognize borders, that grief can be transformed into joy, and that the bravest thing a person can do is choose happiness despite what others might think. Edward Cabe's nativity scene, the one he created during that dark winter of 1944, remained at what became the Algona POW Museum, opened in 1988 to commemorate the camp and the extraordinary story it represented. The museum displays photographs of prisoners working in fields, letters exchanged between POWs and Iowa families, and oral histories from both prisoners and local residents. But the nativity remains the centerpiece, a reminder that even in captivity, even in defeat, human beings can create beauty and hope. The museum receives visitors from Germany regularly, many of them children and grandchildren of former prisoners, making pilgrimages to understand the place that changed their ancestors' lives. They walk through the same fields their grandfathers worked, meet families whose grandparents employed POW labor, and hear stories of transformation that seem almost mythological in their improbability. But the evidence is everywhere. In the German names in local cemeteries, in the families that still maintain connections across the Atlantic, in the living proof that former enemies can become family. The story of German POWs in Iowa is many things: a testament to practical necessity, an example of moral complexity, a demonstration of human resilience. But more than anything, it's a story about the stubborn persistence of humanity, even in circumstances designed to destroy it. It's about farmers who chose kindness over hatred, prisoners who chose hope over bitterness, and communities that chose, however reluctantly at first, to see individuals rather than enemies. The fields of Iowa still produce corn and soybeans, still feed the nation, still roll toward horizons that seem infinite, but they also hold memories of transformation, of the summer days when German soldiers and American farmers worked side by side, learning that the things that unite human beings, the need for food, shelter, dignity, connection, are stronger than the things that divide them. The barbed wire is long gone, the guard towers dismantled, the barracks turned to dust, but the legacy remains in the families who carry both German and American blood, in the friendships that lasted decades, in the simple truth that even the deepest wounds can heal if people are willing to let them. Werner Schmidt died in 2003 at the age of 92, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, in the farmhouse he'd built on land he'd once worked as a prisoner. His obituary in the Algona newspaper described him as a beloved community member, skilled farmer, and devoted family man. It mentioned, almost in passing, that he had come to Iowa as a German POW in 1943. By then, it was just another fact in a long and well-lived life, no more remarkable than any other detail. And perhaps that was the greatest triumph of all, that his origin story had become ordinary, that the extraordinary journey from enemy to neighbor to citizen had been so completely integrated into the community's history that it no longer required explanation. The Iowa prairie is wide and flat and unforgiving in its beauty. It demands honesty from those who work it, rewards persistence, and has no patience for pretense. Maybe that's why this story happened here, in this place where character matters more than pedigree, where actions speak louder than origins, and where the soil doesn't distinguish between seeds planted by American hands or German ones. Both grow the same way, both need the same sun and rain, both yield the same harvest if tended with care. This is what happened when enemy soldiers came to Iowa and found not hatred but possibility, not revenge but redemption, not rejection but, eventually, belonging. Some of them went home when the war ended, but others discovered that home isn't always where you're born. Sometimes it's where people see you not for who you were, but for who you could become. Sometimes it's where strangers become neighbors, where prisoners become citizens, where former enemies become family. Sometimes home is a choice, made despite everything that should make it impossible, sustained by nothing more than hope and stubborn human decency. And sometimes, on quiet Iowa evenings when the corn rustles in the breeze and the sun sets over fields that have seen so much history, you can almost hear the echoes of German folk songs mixing with American hymns, the sound of two worlds that should have remained forever separate, somehow, against all odds, learning to sing in harmony. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.